legislation, posing a question on the on legislation actually. So to Shan, Yahampath,
and we are supposed to do stakeholder engagement within the next month, but I'm afraid given the New Year holidays, it might take a longer time. However, we are supposed to present it to the cabinet by the end of May 2023. The rest is up to the Aegis department, and again, I'm afraid it might take quite a bit of time. I'll tell you as to why later. So given the complexity of our labor laws, I think it has been discussed in various forums, so I don't have to talk about how complex, how ambiguous, how discriminatory our labor laws are. It has been a popular topic all around the country for decades. So we haven't done any research in terms of asking our stakeholders as to what the problems are, because we already know what the problems are. There are enough and more information available in the public domain. Given these factors that I just mentioned, there are certain things that we don't talk about in public. What these reasons are, our labor laws don't focus on competitiveness. It doesn't focus on productivity, it doesn't focus on efficiency of our labor force, of our economy. So we have taken these issues into consideration, and so we have done certain changes, and in terms of these changes, some of the reasons that you mentioned, which are focus areas of your network, have been taken into consideration in terms of nighttime restrictions, overtime restrictions, termination of employment of workmen, which is again a very sensitive piece of legislation that we are going to touch. Especially if you look at the labor unions, which are politically motivated, we'll take this matter very seriously. And also occupational safety and health. There are enough and more pending cases in terms of compensation. Sexual harassment, I think one area that you did not mention in your work scope, I was wondering why. And also part-time work and flexible work. So give me a few more minutes again to let you know as to what our objectives are in terms of the labor code. If we understand the situation that we are in as a country, so we need to create more jobs. If you have to create jobs, you have to make it easier for organizations to offer employment for people. And also we have to take into the consideration the contribution made by SMEs. I think Advocata has done a significant amount of work in terms of restrictions that are there for potential entrepreneurs in the country. And also, we also have to understand how our local industries can compete globally without undermining foreign direct investments. Now, if you look at foreign direct investments in our country, one of the reasons as to why they are not very keen, our labor laws are one of the reasons. So we have taken that also into consideration. So in terms of reforms, what do we do? What we have done so far, we have expanded certain existing definitions. We have redefined certain definitions by taking the current context into consideration. We have given those definitions a kind of futuristic outlook, and also we have supplemented certain existing legislations. As a result, we will abolish certain legislations. As an example, TEWA will be one, sensitive area again, and wages board. Even if you look at wages board, there are lots of discriminations across certain industries, so we are going to abolish that. Now, how do we tackle with these sensitive issues in terms of abolishing TEWA Act or abolishing wages board? We are proposing an unemployment insurance. First time in our country, it will be contributory. We have had certain discussions with certain chambers and organizations. They have given us an official okay. Given the cost and the difficulties that they are undergoing at the moment, they like to make a contribution. And we are also looking at the possibility of amending certain acts such as EPF and ETF to see whether they can make a contribution. If you look at the purpose of some of these acts, funds are not properly utilized, that we understand perfectly. And then also, one of the major issues that is there in terms of encouraging female women to take part in the workforce is maternity leave. We have done a research in terms of collecting data. Within the last 5 years, private sector companies have made about 1.2 billion in terms of compensations and salaries. Now, you can look at maternity leave from two different perspectives. Perspective number one is to encourage women to work, make a contribution to the workforce. That's number one. Number two, the biological reproduction process that you mentioned. They are ensuring that we have our future workforce. Now, we have looked at certain countries in the world in terms of best practices. As an example, if you look at South Korea, when a woman gets pregnant, you get an ATM card of some sort for you to buy food and medicine and whatnot. Now, I was wondering, probably they may have a fantastic value system in the society to do that. But it is not the case. It's a rational decision to encourage women to bear children because, you ensure that, our future labor force is taken care of. It might sound like a bit inhumane, but, if you look at it rationally, as a policymaker, that is what we should do. So we have taken that into consideration. Government is looking at the moment, as far as the Unified Labour Code is concerned, to see whether the maternity leave can be paid by the government as part of this social insurance and unemployment insurance, as well as a compensation mechanism. So these are audacious, very ambitious piece of legislation that we have at the moment. And this entails certain other things that we need to do. Now, changing these things is easy, but implementing. So we are looking at digitalizing the entire labor department to ensure that they provide an efficient service. And also, we are one of the countries in the world, especially in this part of the world, we don't have labor market information, labor market intelligence for us to make policy decisions. Now, we have certain primary level data in bits and pieces, but we don't have a proper data warehouse for us to manipulate and make futuristic decisions. So we are in the process of implementing that. In fact, last week we sent a cabinet note, keeping the cabinet informed that we are going to do this. Today there was a launch of digital economy by the president. So probably it will be taken up by the cabinet by next week. So that we will have some sort of idea as to what is going to happen. There we are also looking at an e-wages module. Now, gender pay gap is one of the areas that we did not discuss in this forum. How do we know that? When we have an e-wages mechanism, we can, of course, it would support pay taxes, income taxes and whatnot. At the same time, we can figure out, how women and men are paid. Now, it has to be real time, or the deductions have to be authorized and legal. At any given time, we can look at and see what the difference is, and we will figure out as to why, and in what sectors, in what locations, and in what industries. So that would also give us some insights into how policy decisions should be changed. And also you touched upon dignity of labor. Now, dignity of work is one of the 7 key results areas in our work scope in this year. Now, there are certain jobs that are not considered white collar, and certain individuals, they may have kind of embarrassment to mention in public as to what kind of jobs you are doing. As an example, there are enough and more spas across the Colombo city. If you just go down enough and more, you just wonder whether there are people who are going and taking their services. And every time police goes and raids it, these young girls are in trouble. Now, we understand the fact that there is a need in the society, and we have to have a mechanism to recognize it. So on one side, we are looking at the possibility of providing certain job categories with what we call an occupational or practitioner license, so that you can practice it. You have some sort of legal recognition that you are trained, like if to work in a spa. So that you have to renew it. There are certain regulations and guidelines that you have to adhere to, so that you can say, I'm doing this job. By doing that, we are also doing something. We are trying to bring informal sector employments into the formal sector. So when they go and renew their licenses and whatnot, we can capture data. And then we again can figure out, how many of people are working in what sectors, formal and informal. And then this labor market information system that I just mentioned would register students coming out of schools as well as when they obtain the NIC. So that at any given time, we can say how many people are employed, how many people are unemployed, and in what sectors they are being employed. So it's not just the unified labor code that we are looking at the moment, but the entire change of the society. Now, one thing I'm going to take a bit of time again. Why these reforms have been lethargic for last so many decades, no progressive changes have been made. It is because of the lack of political will and determination. Now we have come to a situation we are compelled to do these progressive changes, and otherwise there's no way we can come out of this. So this is a crisis that we are not going to waste. This is a crisis that we should not waste. Therefore, regardless of the resistance and whatnot that we might come across, we are very ambitious that we can push these reforms.
That sounds very music to our ears, because these are some things that obviously a lot of people in the audience here have been advocating for and asking for. But I'm going to come back to you and ask you, because I'm sure, as you said, some of these laws are like over a century old. And why we have not changed them is because of the opposition. So I'm going to ask you again in the next round, how are you going to deal with that kind of opposition? But then going back to what you talked about on maternity leave, and I'll ask Anarkali this question. So as you said, the cost of maternity leave is basically borne entirely now by the employer. And this obviously has led to discriminatory hiring practices. Talked about the government bearing some of this cost. But given the current fiscal situation, do you think this is a priority for the government? Should the government be putting their money here, or are there other priorities?
Okay. So thank you for inviting me today. I think that's a tough question because of where we are economically, and we already have a very large government and very large expenditure by the government. So I'm not sure it's necessarily that you're asking the government to take all of this on, but maybe there's certain targeting that they have to do. So like Shiromal mentioned, the SMEs and the smaller companies, this is a burden that may be difficult for them to handle. So are there ways for us to either give them an incentive or some way to subsidize that cost, right? I do feel that one of the problems with when we look at something like maternity leave, everybody considers this a cost. That's how companies see it. So when you're hiring, as Shiromal pointed out, when you hire women, even though you may not, it's not politically correct, and it's not, in many countries it's illegal to ask a woman, are you going to have children? This is what's going through many employers' minds. Are you going to have children? When are you going to have them? Are you going to come back to us, right? And I think it's important that companies look at this as an investment, right? Because women are still judged in the labor force exactly the same as men. So those biological, reproductive, that angle is just not taken into account, right? And bringing women into the labor force, and then when they step out of it to take on that caregiver role, bringing them back in is not fully considered. So that's why I think it's important that companies look at it as an investment. It's like you going away, doing an MBA, and you're brought back in, right? So in order to equalize the playing field, you have to look at some of these angles. And I think it's, you see these, and the caregiver role also, it's a very societal, it's not just policy, it's society as well, right? That role is supposed to be borne entirely by women. And if you look at it, countries like Scandinavia, in the Scandinavian countries, if you look at Denmark, Sweden, their female participation rates are 75 to 77%, because you have both maternal and paternal leave. There's a lot more in terms of the social, the daycare, primary schools, all of those are geared towards supporting women. The flip side of it is many companies don't like that either. They find it restrictive, they find that it's very difficult in terms of their cost structures. So, there's a shift that has to happen where it's not only a woman that's responsible for all of the caregiving, but it can be something that's divided, right? And I think the flexibility in the workforce is also something that would help. It took a global pandemic for people to realize you could work from home, and you could actually have more flexibility. So now everyone has shifted to a 4-day week, which it was unheard of. It was unthinkable for women to do these things, right? So I think that huge societal shifts that are happening, it's important that people see that as a possibility. And these costs, I think, have to be seen more as an investment. You know, we're going to if you look at it, people who are under the age of 60 on average today will live to be 100. So why is it that we're saying that we have to go into this labor force and you have to come out of it by a particular age? Why can't women go into it later even? You know, our biological clock may not fit in with the traditional ways that we see career paths. So I think there's got to be some flexibility there.
So that's very interesting actually, that we change the way, the attitude towards how women or when women enter the labor force or leave the labor force, etc. I just want to move to you, Sumini. I know you've done a lot of work on the cost of women being in the labor force, or cost of working actually, in terms of the affordability and of, particularly in terms of the childcare aspect, but also even if these legislations are changed of part-time work or night-time work particularly, we don't have the infrastructure is not there, and women tend to have to pay extra to make use of these things. Could you talk a little bit about that, and what changes do you want to see that will enable more women to actually participate in the labor force?
So let me just start by talking a little bit about just the childcare component, because that's something I don't think we've talked about too in depth yet. So when we look at the data, there's really two main milestones where women fall off the labor force: marriage and childbirth. In both of these cases, obviously patriarchal gender norms are at play, but a really key part of that puzzle is that women and families really don't have access to childcare services in Sri Lanka. And why is that the case? It's because for so long we've really relied on the unpaid labor of women, and to be frank, the unpaid labor of grandmothers to really support the childcare infrastructure in Sri Lanka. And it's not just access to childcare really, there's really three components to it. There's the issue of access, the fact that robust childcare infrastructure doesn't exist in Sri Lanka, but there's also the issue of the lack of quality childcare services. There is a second component where if you don't trust the services available, you're not going to then trust your children to be taken care of by a childcare service provider, be it the daycare center or be it a private provider. And that lack of quality childcare also contributes then to the stigma that we then attach to women to say, oh, you're a bad mother if you're not staying home to take care of your children. So that's the second component. And the third component with childcare is the lack of affordable childcare. So our research actually finds that for women, even if they are willing to trust the childcare services available, if they do end up sending their child to daycare, the cost of them to do their job then, including the cost of the daycare facility or the paid provider, then exceeds the earnings that they're going to receive. So really, maybe some of us in the room, earnings-wise, it makes sense, but truly for the majority of women in this country, childcare services are not affordable. And sort of considering that, what happens as a result is that working for women especially is a rational choice. It's a rational choice. Do I just stay home and do this myself? Or do I then bear this extreme cost, both a very real rupee cost, but also a very big emotional strain on women, on families themselves? And that's sort of the choice that gets made. So what can we really start doing about it policy-wise? As you asked correctly, Dr. Roshan, one of the logistically easiest things to do is regulate the childcare industry. And we're not really starting from scratch here because the Sri Lankan government actually drafted a national guideline for regulating childcare services back in 2019, I believe. But for some reason, lack of political will, government change, it was not implemented. And these standards are actually very, very robust. It looks at everything from the quality provider, the access to it, even in like rural areas, and all of these things are considered, but it was not implemented. So logistically, because again, there's always going to be pushback from government when we bring these things up to say, oh, we don't have the money right now, we don't have the resources. But this is actually quite an easy policy to implement. And even the monitoring of how this policy is implemented is very much detailed, and it's at the local level. So it doesn't take a lot of additional resources for us to begin to regulate the childcare industry. And that's something that we as a country really need to start prioritizing at the moment. And secondly, here I'm going to disagree with you, Shiromal, but I think the private sector has a role to play with childcare, because it's not necessarily a service you're providing to your female employees, but it actually makes business sense as well. A lot of global studies have shown that actually when you provide, be it a creche facility or even employer-sponsored childcare as sort of a benefit to your remuneration package, there is actually sort of an increase in productivity in the workplace, and at the same time you're attracting the best talent. And by doing so across the board in the industry, you're raising the standard for employees, and that's beneficial to us. It's beneficial for everyone. So actually, if the private sector isn't somewhat involved, we're all losing. The country's losing, the economy's losing, women are losing, and families are losing. So how can we really, and Sri Lanka actually has made some quite nice progress in this area, where a lot of larger corporations now do have attached childcare facilities, creche facilities that have seen quite a bit of success. So how can we scale that? How can we actually move that into a more mainstream policy? And I think, again, this is not comprehensive. These are just some of the first few steps we can take with regards to childcare. And I'm choosing to focus on this because it's sort of a piece of that puzzle we often ignore when it comes to women's labor force participation and just women's ability to access economic opportunities overall.
Okay, thank you. I think that is one area that we want to focus in this network in terms of, because I think that is low-hanging fruit, as you pointed out, which will have a huge impact if we're able to push that through. So I'm going to move a little bit differently, and I'm going to ask you, Sampath, more, because I think you're an HR person. I think the statistics were shown that, I mean, females outnumber men in terms of school enrollments and even university enrollments. But in certain sectors of the economy, certain subjects really, and I talked about the STEM subjects, women, lag men. Why is that? And I mean, is there something that can be done to sort of encourage women to go into those subjects? Because obviously that will hugely increase their earning capacity and earning potential. That's question one. And the other one is actually in terms of vocational training. Because when you talk of vocational training, we always think of sort of male-dominated vocations. There's very little vocational training in terms of what females would more likely do. Why is that? And they are expected to sort of do more kind of on-the-job training rather than formal training. Do you see that in the work you do, and how can we change these?
Well, let me play the devil's advocate role here, right? Because I've been hearing a lot about promoting this. So maybe it was my background as well, because my family, I was the only son, so I had 3 sisters, and when listening to Shiromal, I was thinking, where's that extra chicken piece that I got, right? And now I have a wife and I have 2 daughters, so I'm again outnumbered there. And of course, my younger daughter asked a very interesting question recently, because I found the mother's maiden, the identity card, and she asked, how come you have a different name here and different name here? And I said, because after marriage you take, the woman take the father's, the surname. And she's asked, why is that? Why do the woman has to take the father's surname? And I couldn't actually answer, right? So anyway, coming back to your point. So again, my experience is at least 2 decades, right? So I've been working in the banking sector. So I have seen there's not much of a difference in participation. I have seen it's basically male, female, kind of equal numbers. And then hospitality, then later on in apparel, and now in tech. So one question that you asked was like, when it comes to STEM education, whether why women are not doing well or something. Again, when I go to the universities, most of the time the tech universities, the degrees that they do, we cannot pinpoint and say that it's lacking as such, right? We get to see more and more the female participation in all these the sectors, as well as in universities and even in degree programs. But then again, maybe in certain sectors, of course, we haven't seen, like, for an example, construction or certain sectors, of course, you may not see that. So for your questions, I think there is nothing stopping them coming in. Actually, now it's very progressive, and whatever the awareness that's been done seems to be working. But then again, what I don't have the context is the rural. There's a lot being told about. There's a lot of things have been discussed in this kind of these audiences. But when we go into the the rural areas and the areas which is not much awareness, whether that's probably been kind of whether that is like popular in those areas, right? So let me again tell you another experience of mine. So when we did some time back, this nothing to do with women empowerment, but there was this Tarunaruna, I think it's to empower the unemployed graduates. So what I have seen involved in that is, most of the time the reasons why these unemployed graduates also find less opportunities is mainly because in those areas they don't have role models. For an example, when I asked from these graduates, the most successful person that they have seen is with a lot of respect, I'm saying they have seen only a Grama Sevaka or maybe a principal or a teacher kind of thing. So they do not think beyond that. So maybe one reason is that these audiences has not seen many of those examples and role models, so for them to inspire. So one suggestion that I would have is, even in your own kind of programs, is that I know now there's International Women's Day and there was so much of forum. Probably this is the 10th or the 12th forum that I am actually taking part in. But I don't know in the same frequency it will be done in these areas. Probably that's a very important. And the moment you go and explain them about these challenges that everybody was talking about, childcare and the problems that they have, listening to these success stories kind of thing, will actually show them those opportunities. And then they will get inspired in order to, kind of involve more and participate more in these forces. And also workforce. And also, let me tell you another insights coming again purely from practical, working in the organization. I've seen the women participation at the entry levels, we don't see much. But we have seen at the mid career, only that we see a lot of people, a lot of women dropping out. So the reasons have already been mentioned. Probably one everyone spoke about is the child care piece, right? Then again, I agree with Shiro on her keynote, is because the reason is one thing is quality, access to quality, child care, and affordable also. But then again, that emotional thing of leaving. I had the same thing. I had to leave my daughter, younger one, in a daycare, and it was a very difficult decision that we took. But actually, it's better for the child also, because there's a lot of children and safety, and other than if you stay with the grandmother, she will put a cartoon and do something like that. It's more productive than that. But then again, one aspect that you have never that you all didn't speak was about the elderly population. It's not only child care. If there's a mother or a father or a mother-in-law, if they are also having a kind of sickness or a long-term disease or something like that, mostly it's the women who kind of save. So again, now elderly houses, right? If you have elderly care, again the attitude, it comes to attitude. Can you leave your parents? The attitude in the society is that you are leaving the parents with a, I don't know, they use wrong wording also, right? Mahalu madama or something like that, right? Maybe in that case also, there's some social, kind of attitudinal, perceptual kind of factors impacting more. And it's not only the policy or the regulatory, these kind of frameworks can tackle that. So that's my take on that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. So I think talking about the gender stereotypes and cultural norms, so I'm going to turn back to Sumini. As you said, I think women, the problem is because women bear greater responsibility for not only childcare but all kind of unpaid care and domestic work. So my question is, how do you get men more involved in this in these roles, which are traditionally done by women? And even if you have like parental leave, not just maternity leave, I think in many countries where they have had that, men have ended up doing, using that time to, I was listening to a webinar on academics, and they end up, writing more papers because they've got more time, whereas women are actually still continuing to do their housework. So how do you actually change these gender sort of norms?
That's a heavy question. I think sort of the starting point really is that we need to, as a society, start thinking that and acknowledging that care work and household work is work, and it's valuable work. It's work with economic value. And sort of when you start to see that, you give dignity to that type of work, right? And that's very important to like start creating that shift in your mindset, that this is not just something that needs to be done so it gets passed on, but when you see it as truly valuable work for society, for economies to function, it almost sets off a little shift in people's brains. And it also gives dignity to then women and also men who then might end up sort of either choose to take it up already or might consider it a little bit more to truly consider that type of work. And at the end of the day, changing cultural norms takes changing the minds of men. That is the bottom line. Someone told me yesterday, behind every successful woman is a man. And I thought it was a very true, it's a joke, but it's true. You really can't achieve much if you don't change the minds of men. And you rightfully said things like parental leave. They're sort of the first steps in creating that change. And you're right, it doesn't naturally lead to men taking up then again more care work. They might end up spending it more on their jobs itself. And part of that is then for us as society and particularly employers to start rethinking what employment looks like. Because right now we almost operate on this assumption that the employee, like this is sort of your entire life. This is you're able to commit your physical presence, your entire mental space to your place of employment, to this. And we operate, again, because our employment structure is catered to mostly the male employee, we operate on the assumption that everything back home in the care space, in the household sphere, is taken care of by someone else, which is also what then disadvantages women. So how can we start rethinking in the mainstream sense what employment looks like? And this part of it is through mainstreaming things like flexible work options, remote work. And again, I don't think there's a shortcut to really convincing men, and not just convincing them, then encouraging and incentivizing them to take up their fair share of work. But we need to first facilitate the environment for them to even take it up, because it doesn't happen overnight. It is not easily really done. But what we can do is take the tangible steps to create that environment through again, the government has a role to play, the private sector has a role to play. We all truly have that role to play in creating these policies and nurturing that environment, so that over time we can slowly see that shift happen. And I think that's sort of the only way to really do that, because we always love to make excuses. We love to say, oh, there's no point having parental leave, there's no point having this policy, no man's going to take it up. It's a waste of our money, employer money. But that's sort of the reason why we're stuck where we are, is because no one is willing to sort of start those tangible changes that may not have results in like a month or two, but over time, it'll get us somewhere, and we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely, you have to start somewhere. And I'm going to get back to Anarkali and ask you, Sampath talked about these role models, and I think that has a huge impact really on if women enter the labor force or not. What do you think we can do from this, in terms of this network, in terms of modeling this to not only in the, I think someone said not only in the urban areas, but in the rural areas as well. How do we sort of get that sort of conversation going? And
yeah, I think that seeing the role models and representation is important, right? It sets a shift in not just women, but men as well, right? I grew up in a household with a working mother, and so to me, becoming a woman who went on to work and was going to manage also having children and seemed like the norm, because that didn't seem like an unusual thing to do, having had that role model. And I think, as was mentioned, I think the dignity of work is also important. Like, we have a large population of women who leave this country and go work in other countries, and they're leaving their children behind. And they don't have, it's not just childcare, they don't have an option in this, right? They're choosing that because that's the way they feel they can secure a future for their children. But I wonder if there are things that we can do, like Shiromal was saying, if we can get through changing some of the cultural barriers and also supporting them with policy. If you can draw those women to be in our leisure sector, if we can convince them that you have these opportunities, right? Then I think, and you see those role models, then hopefully that also encourages people. Like, and one of the things I realized actually through the COVID time was that women are quite good at being smaller entrepreneurs. They're very quick to start businesses. They can hustle. They'll do things because they want to make ends meet, and they do these things that, what it's called, whether it's called a gig economy or a side or whatever. But a lot of women did these jobs, and there's value in those jobs. So it's not just about being employed. They're entrepreneurial. And so if we can support women in those entrepreneurial activities, I think that's also something that's very important.
Absolutely, and I think that's what this network also, I think, wants to do, is try to see how we can generate these economic opportunities for women so that we can retain them rather than have them go into, unskilled labor somewhere else or in risky environments outside the country. So I'm going to come back to you, Shan, and ask you again. You had a very long agenda of things that you're going to do. Do you have sort of milestones in terms of what you want to achieve and when you're going to achieve them, and also how you're going to deal with the opposition which is going to come? Because why we haven't changed these laws is there's opposition from everyone. So how are you going to deal with that, or have you thought about that? And how can we as a network actually support you in that?
I think the entire transformation is a big, hairy, audacious goal, as they call it. But as I mentioned earlier, we have a strong political will that this change has to be done. Under any circumstances, these are not negotiable, because these are for the betterment of the country, these are for the betterment of our economy, these are for the betterment of our future generations to come. It is just that we haven't had that political will in the past. No one has done things that are not popular. Now, if you look at think tanks like Advocata, their role is to educate people, let people know that these are the necessary changes. But when there is a strong political opposition that are cutting them down, whatever the amount of work that they do will be useless. I think right now we have a right combination. We have enough and more information and research, policy drafts done by different people, and then we also have a strong political will that is willing to make these changes possible. So in terms of milestones, we are trying to implement most of these changes by the beginning of next year, 2024. We have done a substantial amount of homework, but formalizing these things might take quite a bit of time. Now, we presented our first proposal, in fact, in terms of night work restriction in the IT and ICT sector. It was first taken up in February last year. The National Labour Advisory Council met 5 times afterwards. They never discussed this. When we first took the office in May 2022, that was our first agenda item. And when we presented this to the National Labour Advisory Council, one of the union leaders, who was about 70+ years, with due respect, he said, අපි මේක මේ ගැහණු ළමයින්ගෙන් අහන්න ඕනේ නේද? Like these are software engineers that we are talking about, those who are working for leading software companies. And I said, there's nothing to ask, it's a fact. This is a growing industry, and we have potential to be one of the largest destinations in terms of IT and ICT in this country. Why are we not encouraging female to work? That can easily contribute good 2 to 3 billion per annum in terms of US dollars. That's a huge industry. So we as policymakers, we have to look at these things rationally. You can't use culture. Culture and values are important. They are up to people to uphold. Policymakers should ensure that there's a level playing field for everyone to play. So any industry, anyone can survive. So how do we deal with the opposition? You tell me, I have no idea. So I think that is where chambers, private sector organizations, investors, even individuals such as yourselves and think tanks can play a leading role. Put an equal pressure on the government, saying that these reforms are really necessary. We have all this enough and more problems today because of not only because we had a lack of political will. At the same time, we as a nation, we as citizens, we were complacent, or we were not willing to take chances, or we were just passing it on to someone, saying someone will do it, or it will never happen in our country, as you mentioned. No point talking about these things. But it has come to a point now. Someone has to do it. I think this crisis is that crucial turning point in our history. Someone has to do it. So we have that political will, strong determination. That's all what we have. I think with that we will try our level best to push it through, and then hopefully the rest of the nation will join us in supporting us in making a reality.
So we really hope that you'll be able to make that, and I'm sure there are all of us here would really support you in that. But in the interest of time, we are running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to ask you any more questions, but just a sort of a last run through. If you can tell us what you would like to see from this network, and maybe starting from Sampath, if you can just say.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned there are two parts to it, right? One is, as you rightly pointed out at the beginning, everyone, to increase the participation, there are certain fundamental things that needs to be done. So I have seen particularly that women progressing in the career, those mid-career challenges that they go through needs to be addressed, and that of course will get addressed through some of these macro infrastructure kind of improvement things that you already discussed about affordable childcare to various other the supporting mechanisms that you can do. Now I'm actually representing a tech industry company, so we can see, as someone mentioned, so we are working from home for the last 3 years. Even now we are working from home, and we have seen a number of the women who's dropping out at the mid-career has tremendously dropped, even in a talent crunch when their attrition rates are high and all in the industry. But we have seen comparatively it has dropped. So that means that flexi time and flexible work schedules and all those things has helped them to survive in the organization, and that will give that will help them to go into the top as well. Because if you drop in the mid-career, you will see it's a pipeline, right? For you to move up in the ladder is difficult. But I was taking part in certain other think tanks, USA, they were even talking about having some quota systems, whether in a board you need to have X amount of, kind of women representation. Parliament, they were talking about increasing the number of, women MPs and things like that, right? That's one aspect of it. The other aspect, probably that is through the policies and, the lobbying and all the stuff with I think it's one of the most prominent think tanks in Sri Lanka, and it's been taken very seriously, and you all have that power. So maybe through this initiative, maybe you can actually make this thing happen from the decision makers. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect, I would say, the weight that I would give is to for reach out to kind of empower and educate, mentor, sometimes coach. I'm sure there are a lot of people, volunteers, even companies like us, we can actually support in order to kind of take part in these things and go out and spread this message. So probably that will actually will be the biggest the game changer, because you will then see it's not more of a push, but it's more of a pulling coming from the community, right? So and then we can also in that way increase their participation, as well as we would be able to kind of particularly go and give that message that you can be actively take part in. So I think your think tank would probably be able to, or this initiative rather, would be able to focus on that. That would be great.
Okay, thank you.
We've not seen much happening. Yeah.
Thank you. Anarkali?
I think bringing all the stakeholders together, I think that's really important, and how you're going to bridge the sort of gaps between from policymakers to some of these stakeholders. And I think the key part of this that I'd like to see is the action part of the network, so that I think there's a lot that goes on in Sri Lanka where policy is laid out and then things just don't get implemented. So I think that action component is what I'd really like to see.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Shan, what?
I think, in my opinion, we do a lot of research and policy papers. If you have to see a tangible change, we have to go to grassroots level. We have to work with people, we have to educate them, we have to tell them stories, we have to inspire them, we have to give them opportunities, and we have to get them exposed. At a very high level, policy papers and research will make a difference in terms of policy reforms. But at the end of the day, these young women, girls have to come out of their houses and they have to come to society, join the world of work. So they need that inspiration, confidence, and so I think we as a nation, we are lacking that. So I think this network could be an ideal opportunity to look into some of these possibilities of inspiring young women to take up more challenges in the future.
Thank you.
I think we're at the end of Women's Month, and usually with the end of that month is until the next year we sort of stop talking about women's issues. So maybe the power of this network really is to not let us take the foot off the pedal, so to speak, and truly to leverage, I guess, our networks, our collective resources, and the collective, and as Anarkali rightfully said, potential for collective action to continue to have these conversations and then convert those conversations into action, and to make sure those actually go through. Because most often than not, we do the work, we build the evidence, we build the case, and that's where it stops. So maybe this is an opportunity to truly make sure that we convert it into actual tangible change that improves women's access to economic opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much. And this has been a really interesting discussion. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But I think the key message, I think, from everybody is it cannot be just a talk. It's not just talk. We need to we have to see tangible action. So I hope this network will actually come together to see real tangible change in this area. So thank you, everybody, and I'll hand it over to Sumi.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists and moderator. As Dr. Roshan said, unfortunately, due to time constraints, we were unable to take the questions on Slido. But just like everybody mentioned on the panel, the Women's Policy Action Network is all about making this change and continuing to talk about this. So we will not forget your questions. We'll definitely take it into consideration. And you can, I will also shortly be mentioning the social media platforms, so you can share your questions there as well. We will also share our responses through explainer videos and infographics and so on. And as we now come to the end of today's event, we would like to extend our thanks to the Netherlands Embassy for supporting this event, and to the Advocata Institute for facilitating this event. And most importantly, thank you to the wonderful team who worked tirelessly the past few days to really make this event happen. And you can support the Women's Policy Action Network by following their social media page, by scanning the QR code which is on screen right now. And please share your feedback about this event as you exit the event hall. You will notice our team members with video cameras who will be recording your feedback. And please feel free to share your thoughts and feedback in any language you feel comfortable in. And we also have a photo booth set up outside, so please feel free to utilize that as well. Refreshments are also available outside, so please do serve yourselves. Thank you everyone for your attention and attendance for today, and I hope you all have a good night. Thank you.